he used was from daily life, jars. They used jars for everything. They had pottery they used for water. They had pottery. Their plates were made from pottery. They did storage in pottery. Their wine was in big jars, pottery jars, many of them that would be buried in the ground to keep it cool, and then have a kind of a fairly large mouth at the top where you could dip water or wine out of that. So jars were very, very common to them. So he's saying something about himself and the church when he looks at Christians in the first century. Now, this is early in the history of Christianity. There had been no 2,000 years of history like we have. When we think of the word Christian, it has a lot of history to it, right? And in fact, everyone here brings some history with them, even when I use the word Christian. You may either think of just sort of generic Christians, or the Western world maybe is more Christian than the Eastern world, or there's some interaction that all of us have. If we grew up in a Christian home, we bring a certain perspective. If we really didn't have any exposure to Christianity, obviously another very different perspective. In this day and time, obviously Christianity was not in a very strong position. When Paul was in Corinth, he met up with Jews that had been kicked out of Rome, and they became kind of mates in the church there. He worked with them and helped them with the church. There was actually evidence of a synagogue in Corinth in the first century, but there were also quite a few Gentiles in that church, which we can tell from reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Christianity is probably not, if I'm understanding it right, not real strong in Australia, right? I don't think, would Australians consider this a Christian nation? I don't think so, right? Now, the United States used to consider itself a Christian nation, but we passed that at least by the end of the 20th century. Right now, there was a time when maybe 60 to 70% of all Americans attended church at least twice a month. That's a high percentage of church of any kind of Christian group. Now it's much less than 50%. And since the pandemic, it went down another. Most churches even have declined maybe 20 to 30% just since the pandemic, and people didn't get back into the routine of worshiping with other Christians. So the West is, at least in the United States, we're like England. You've heard of Westminster Abbey. Would you like to guess how many worship there on Sunday morning? They have a number of services, and there are many Sundays. You probably have more here than they do at Westminster Abbey in London. And so you've got throughout Europe, there's been a major, I think, decline in Christianity. So when you just talk about Christianity to the public, they may not have a good view of it or understanding of it. Some are quite neutral about it. One thing that we certainly are seeking to do in the churches of Christ is to try to be followers of Christ as we find in Scripture. And so the study of the Bible is important to us, more than just tradition or history. History is good to kind of know where we came from and kind of the influences, but we really want to go back to what we understand as disciples of Christ, particularly as we read it from the Gospels, and then especially as we read it from the writings of Paul and Peter and James and John. They help us rethink in a modern day and time, what does it mean to be a disciple of Christ? So here's a term Paul uses, or a way to describe it, that I think everyone in Corinth who were actually followers of Christ would appreciate, because the church there was a bit fragile. It's young. They're dealing with a lot of problems. Do you remember some of the problems from 1 Corinthians? Any of you studied 1 Corinthians recently? Remember some of the problems and the challenges of the church in Corinth? What? Yes, division. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and so on. What else? Remember anything else? They actually had a long list. In fact, almost every chapter in 1 Corinthians or every one or two chapters about some of these problems. And I am so grateful for that because I spend a lot of time with church leaders, and I've yet to see a church as bad as Corinth. So it just really is comforting to know that all churches have challenges just because we're people. But it could be a whole lot worse, like Corinth. And so this is a good guide for us to be what God really wants us to be as His disciples, and to give grace to ourselves. There's a lot of growing that we all have to do, both individually and as a group. So let's read this is from chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians. I'll begin in verse 7. For we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Well, it's kind of hard to drop in the middle of a letter here and not see. What is the this? We have this treasure. What is the treasure? Well, we have to back up and read several verses before this. Let's start at verse 4. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. So the light of the gospel is this treasure, and it's the glory of Christ, the honor of Christ, who's the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord. So we have this message as if, anybody ever watched the movie Message in a Bottle? It was an older movie, Message in a Bottle. Somebody, found it many years later, put it out to sea. So there's a message in a jar, this special message that he's calling the gospel of the honor of Christ, who is the image of God. And it's not about ourselves, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Short, he's saying what followers of Christ have in these very fragile clay jars is this relationship with God through Christ, and that's sort of the good news of the gospel, that is now a part of our lives. We're that jar that carries around that special message. But the message also defines our mission. Why do we live? Why do we get up in the morning? What's our purpose in life? And I think as a disciple of Christ, to me, one of the good news of a lot of the Christians I've been blessed to know is they're people with a clear purpose in life. Very clear purpose in life. They know why they're here. They know they see God working in their lives, and they see God blessing them. And if you really sense God working in your life, it's fairly easy to conclude that you are worth something to God. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, we're special to God. Every life is special to God. The world doesn't make us feel that way. The world sometimes treats us as trash. And lives are disposable and life is cheap. But not in our relationship with God. Something good. That's good news. That the good news we take away is you are worth something. That you are valuable to God. As adults we need it, but don't young adults need that message? Do teenagers need that message in our day and time? It's something that's really a blessing that he calls this sort of good news gospel. That's bringing light to our life. If we think our life isn't worth anything, that's living in darkness. We just don't know where we are. But if we know that we are worth something to God, which we know from the gospel, then that's good news. But the good news is in jars of clay. What is Paul wanting us to... What's the contrast here? If it's all up to us... Looks like you're about ready to answer.
I was just going to say, contrast is between pottery and the treasure. There's a contrast between the people and the vessels and the treasure they contain.
Yes. I mean, this message is global and it's eternal. You can't contaminate it. You can't cheapen it. You cannot water it down. I mean, I've known some places in the world they put water in the gas so you don't get a full, tank of gas. You get, you can't do that with the gospel. When you see the Gospels as it portrays Jesus, who he really is, the beauty of that message in the bottle, the message in the jar, is not dependent on the value of the jar. He didn't say we were a gold pot. He said we're a clay jar that's easy to break. Right? We're fragile. So the power of the gospel is not in us. As he said, it's not about us. It is about God. And it's a focus on God. So as a disciple of Christ, one of the differences before I became a Christian, after I became a Christian, is before I became a Christian, you just look at life. It's kind of like what I do with my life, and it's my choices, and I have freedom to choose. I mean, it's kind of about me. And as we all know, we've probably made some bad choices down that road because we all have very limited knowledge and very limited experiences. But when we become a Christian and we're a disciple of Christ, it's now about what is God calling me to do? What does God want from me? And what is God blessing me to do so that I can be an instrument, a clay pot in his service? So this is a great analogy, I think. Verse 8. This is the church in Corinth appreciates that, and in a lot of places in the world today, when he says, we are afflicted in every way. You can break our pots. You can throw a rock at it and break them. But we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. Anything in our world today perplex you? It's getting pretty complicated, is it not? And perplexing. And to me, I get perplexed when I can't solve it. I like to fix things. I was a math major and the oldest in the family, and probably being a strong-willed male, I'm just a fix-it. I'm a fixer. I just want to fix it. And it's really frustrating when you can't fix it. Eileen reminded me that yesterday I was driving in Los Angeles traffic, and I was getting a bit perplexed. I'm sure you don't have that here, but they do there. And people cutting in front, and then there's one lane, then 3 lanes down to 1. It takes 45 minutes to get there. It should take 10. Everybody know what I'm talking about? It's like, life gets that way too, because I think it's an easy thing from here to there, and all of a sudden I have all these interferences in my life that messes all my plans up. Like, we had planned to be here yesterday morning, not this morning. Missed our flight by 10 minutes. That would perplex anybody when it wasn't our fault. They just got there an hour late, and we had a 55-minute layover, so we missed the flight. Anyway, he said we're perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Now, for someone who says, and this has often happened, someone becomes a follower of Christ and starts having some challenges in life, and an observer who's not a follower of Christ says, well, if you're a follower of Christ, should you not have any problems? If Jesus is with you, then you shouldn't have any problems. That's not what Paul says, right? Christians, disciples of Christ, suffer many of the same challenges as anybody else in the world. The thing that's different is our perspective on that. What do we do with those challenges? Do we let them defeat us? Or does our faith and the blessing we have in Christ give us a different perspective on the challenges that we face? So he says, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. What does he mean by that? If you're a disciple of Christ, you'll know that when we're baptized, we die to self, we're buried in the water of baptism, we rise to walk in new life. So in a sense, we're carrying the death of Christ. We now identify with Christ. And now the cross of Christ takes away our sins. There's this sense of death and resurrection that we all participate in when we're baptized. So he says so we're always carrying the death of Christ, so that the resurrection can take place, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our bodies. For we who live as disciples of Christ are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifest in our mortal flesh. Just in our mortal bodies, which is clay pots, right? I kind of like that analogy, because what do we return to when we die? The same stuff a clay pot's made out of? So he's just saying in our clay pots, we still manifest this life of Christ. So death is at work in us. Now he's speaking about, if you'll notice, this letter was written by Paul and Timothy. Paul and Timothy are sacrificially serving the church in Corinth and Ephesus and so many other places. And he said, it's, death is at work in us, but life in you. Life in you. So what he does is with a purpose, right? Even he suffers with purpose. In his case, there's meaning and suffering. There's meaning and suffering. And it's a perspective we take on a lot of the challenges we face in life. So let me walk through some things here related to this treasure in clay jars. These are for, since we lived in Israel 9 years, and I excavated in 2 places, in Caesarea and in Beit Shemesh. So I have an Old Testament, New Testament experience. And having lived in Israel, there's several good antiquities dealers I know in the old city of Jerusalem. So I have a pretty good collection of antiquities from the time of David. I have jars from the time of David, which is this one right here. This is one they would have carried incense in, or special ointments in, sometimes oil. They would have carried oil in that. And as you know, in that day and time, oil was used for everything. For olive oil. For lamps, for medical purposes, to cook your food. I mean, it was just, in fact, there's a phrase the Arabs use in the Middle East that when somebody does a little bit of everything, what would you call somebody in Australia? A person, like a man, who can fix anything and do anything.
Jack of all trades.
A what?
Jack of all trades.
Oh, okay, you use the same thing. We call him a jack of all trades. In Israel, they call him Beitinjan, eggplant. Because they use eggplant for everything. Like hummus, well, they've got a dip that's made of eggplant. They call baba ganoush in Egypt. But it's, eggplant's in everything. So they said, first time I heard somebody call him an eggplant, I thought, you mean like egghead or something? They go, no. It means he does everything. I said, oh, that's what that is. So this was oil, especially olive oil, was important. And that's one of the reasons when you read the Old Testament, all of these nations conquered Canaan. The Egyptians conquered Canaan, the Babylonians conquered Canaan, the Assyrians conquered Canaan. They were always being conquered. You know why? That was the equivalent to an oil field because of all the olive trees. Because everywhere in that world, there was a demand for olive oil, and you can't get it. The main producers of olive oil in that area, even to this day, would be Spain, Greece, and Israel. And Spain and Greece were a little more difficult to take. You had to be pretty good at sea. But you can go by land and get access to Israel. There's no natural boundary other than the Mediterranean. So you've got all these nations going through their time and again. The town of Megiddo, which is in the valley of Jezreel, from which we get the word Armageddon. Har is hill of Megiddo. It's from that Jezreel valley. Megiddo itself, they've excavated it, and there's more than 25 strata of civilization of that one tell. of nations coming in, Egyptians took it, and so on, all because of olive oil. Now, the pot on the top right, this one is from the time of David. I have two of them. This is one that was interesting because it was repaired in antiquity. We don't know when it was repaired, but it was clearly, you can tell part of it is very different than the rest of it, but did a pretty good repair job on it. But this would come from the late bronze time of Saul, David, and Solomon. And then the middle one may be more likely a reference that Paul makes here, because it's from the time of Paul. It's first century bean pot. It's Roman pottery, and it's much thinner than either one of those two. You can almost tell from the rim of it. This is really stout, probably the reason it survived for several thousand years. And the same thing with that one. But the bean pot is a much thinner pottery, and it's not really well decorated. It's just plain. Just plain. The Philistines decorated their pottery because they have influence from the Minoans, the Greeks influence. Probably they were the sea people that came from Manoah and the Minoan peoples. And so their pottery reflects the same kind of art on the pottery you'll find in the Greek islands. But the Canaanite pottery, Roman pottery, just plain. Just plain. So Paul says, we are just pots, plain old pots. So it's not the pot that's important, it's what's in it. Now things have changed, right? How many times have you changed your plates and dishes and silverware at your house? We don't use paper plates every day at our house, and we've got our special plates, and that's not the way it was in those days. You just had plain old, it was just very utilitarian. So that's what it looks like. Now, Paul, to get a bigger picture, is Paul has been accused of a lot of things. So Paul himself is a clay pot, easy to break. When you read Corinthians, look at all the things Paul, the apostle, has been accused of. And I say this because it's tough to be a leader anywhere in the world, pretty much anywhere. One of the differences of a follower and a leader is a leader has to learn to cope with criticism. You know you're a leader when you're shot at. In Texas, you have rabbits around here? You don't shoot at rabbits that are still hiding. You shoot at rabbits that are running. They're exposed. Leaders are exposed, and I've never been in a church where leaders weren't criticized. There's always somebody that thinks they can do your job better than you do. In fact, sometimes our own kids think they could do our job better than we do as parents. That's why we really rejoice in grandkids coming. And then they realize, Mom and Dad are better than you were. It's not so easy to be a parent, especially of a kid like you. So when you become leaders, the difference in a leader and a follower is a leader takes criticism. So even if you're a Christian, and even if it's in a church of a lot of good people, they can still be critical of leaders. And that's what Paul dealt with. And here's some of his criticism. One is he vacillates about a visit. Now I know I'm going to go easy on this one because I've tried to visit here twice. But I wasn't vacillating. I wanted to come, but I was hindered in ways, and so was Paul, but they accused him of just not really caring about us. He may come, he may not come. He really doesn't care. Well, Paul was a bit offended by that because he really did care, and he didn't even have, Qantas Airlines to fly on. He was dependent on the weather and the shipping industry and all of that. In chapter 2, he causes pain in his letters and visits. It's like, well, even when he comes, he makes us uncomfortable. Well, Paul was just preaching the truth. He was teaching them. He wanted them to grow. But sometimes they were not open to that. There were those who were very good public speakers, but not a lot of good content. They could talk a good game, but the content wasn't there. Paul had good content, but apparently he wasn't that polished. He just never used PowerPoint. But he was accused of that and said, well, he doesn't even have good references. And he says, references? I need references? You're my letter of references. Look what I did among you. I was in your homes. I helped you become a disciple of Christ. And I need a letter of reference from Jerusalem? I don't think so. He was not trusted with the collection. Remember him wanting to take a collection to Jerusalem? So how did he do it? Do you remember how he did it? It's really interesting how he did it. It was like 5 minutes. Of course, again, they didn't have credit cards. They didn't have bank transfers. So they had to take this chest full of whatever coins and gold they collected from the churches in Macedonia to Jerusalem, to the poor in Jerusalem, which was not uncommon. Because you remember the Jews in the diaspora still had to pay the temple tax. So Jews all over the Roman world, from Rome and other places, were sending the temple tax to Jerusalem. And you know how they did it? Through captains of ships. They were kind of the bursars. They would entrust some captain with X amount of gold, or the half denarii or the shekels, and he would deliver them in Caesarea to some representative from the temple in Jerusalem, and they'd get it that way. So this wasn't new, taking boxes of whatever, of coins and money to Jerusalem. But in his case, he wanted to go to the poor in Jerusalem to make sure there was no question about his integrity. He wasn't married, so you can't trust the guy, right, if he's not married. There's all kinds of, he dealt with this all the time. His letters were frightening. He wasn't really preaching the gospel. In chapter 11, verse 4, they accuse him of that. He wasn't paid. Now, this is an interesting one. If he was really good, they'd pay him for what he did in preaching. Really? I would say he had more integrity by not being paid, and he was willing to sacrifice like anyone else and just serve. But they used that against him because there were some who wanted to be paid for what they did. He was inferior to the other apostles in chapter 12. And then he's weak like a clay pot. And so now he's telling all of them there as disciples of Christ, listen, nothing wrong with being a clay pot. It's not the pot that's important to God. It's what we carry in that. So he said, don't compare yourselves to each other. We do it all the time. What we see others doing, we either become jealous of it or envious of it or critical of it. When he said, no, each one of us are different pots. Just be grateful for what God has put into yours and do well with what God has blessed you with. So we're going to be looking at this. Now in chapter 4, in verse 7, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. 2 Corinthians 4:7. What is his point? It's not about us, right? It's not about us getting credit, how good we look, whatever it is. We want to be respectable and have credibility, but he says, no, it's not that. It's so that in spite of who you are, God can do great things. In spite of who you are. I've been blessed to see churches in all over the world. And it's amazing to me what small churches can do. And it's not because of them, it's because of what God does through them. Because I think a lot of times we say, well, we're a small church, we can't do much, we're just, whatever it is. When Paul would say, no, it really doesn't depend on the size of the church or the kind of pot you have. It's what God does through you. So here's, if you want to take one note from the Bible class this morning, here it is. One statement to take with you. We expect too much from the church and too little from God. We expect too much from the church and too little from God. We expect everybody to be shiny, beautiful, Greek. If you've ever seen Greek pottery, it's amazing. And we expect every church to be just a real museum piece, beautiful pot. But it may not have anything in it. It could be empty. For Paul, he'd rather have a utilitarian clay pot, plain, but it's what is in it that really counts. It's how God works through them. It's how great their faith is. And this might be a point of discussion. Have you struggled with that at times? That, especially when in smaller churches that don't have as many ministries and things going on that might impress people in the neighborhood or whatever it is, it's easy to think we can't do much. And so we don't do much. When the fact is, if we're all have this valuable treasure in all of our lives, there's no limit to what God can do because it's dependent on His abilities, not ours. Anybody been ever like me? I've been Memphis, where we live, has probably 60, 65 congregations of the Churches of Christ, which is probably 3 times what you have in all of Australia. And I know so much about every one of them. None of them are any good. I'm saying that with a smile. But they're all just jars of clay. And yet, when people go visit a church, they have some unrealistic expectation. And yet, through every one of those churches, God can transform lives. God can bless lives. But I think it's just we have such unrealistic expectations of churches that it's hard to really honor God, because if we expected more from God, He'd get more credit for what He did. And we'd be more humble about what we do. We'll serve any way God asks us to serve and realize that we may not see the results of that immediately, but we will do what God's calling us to do. We're simply servants as a clay pot. And so He just wants us and wants them to know the power belongs to God. And remember, this is Corinth. Corinth was one of the third most powerful towns in the Roman Empire. There was Rome, Corinth, Ephesus. So it was a city of power, Roman presence. And they could pull the plug, which they did. An emperor came along and just wiped it out. They could pull the plug on any time they wanted to. And then they rebuilt it, because Corinth was really valuable in getting across the isthmus and sailing on without having to go all the way around Achaia. The power belongs to God and not to us. Do you sing a song? Remember any songs along that line? Any songs that you've sung lately? We can join them, I guess. What's that? There's power in the blood, yes, of cleansing our lives, sin. Do you have the How Great Is Our God? You sung that one? Or Our God is an Awesome God? He reigns. But do we believe it? We want our church to be awesome and God just back in the background somewhere. But if He really is an awesome God, then I think it's seen in our faith with the smallest of things that God can take and use and multiply it in a lot of ways. Well, this imagery of greatness goes way back in especially the Middle Eastern history. Darius, the great king, and something happened. Oh, let's see what it is. I was standing at an angle there. Here's the rest of it. I couldn't see part of the picture there. But he was in the 5th century, 6th century BC. But this was a seal. This was the seal actually found. It's in the museum. And when you roll it out on some clay, this is what it is. And it's a sign of the power of King Darius, who is killing lions. He's got, lions, a symbol of power. We know the Lion of David. It's just that it's always kind of been associated with kingly power. In fact, there are thrones that have been found from that period of time that the foot The legs of the throne are from lions. They're sort of the symbol of lion legs. So it's a symbol of power. So it shows, it's just a symbol of King Darius's power. And in Daniel 6, this is the King Darius in the days of Daniel. Here's what's interesting. This great, powerful Darius, after he encounters Daniel, a servant of God, made this observation about Daniel's God. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel has the power of the lions. It's interesting, the same imagery that Darius uses, quoted in Daniel, is the same thing you find on the seal of Daniel. That's sort of extra biblical material and evidence that is an evidence of that power. I've enjoyed seeing things that have been found in clay jars for this imagery of that it's what's in the jar, not the jar itself, that's important. This is a silver hoard. This is all silver nuggets found in a jar that's from the 10th century, from the time of the judges. It had 19 pounds of silver in 17 money bags. 500 years before coins were ever invented. And it probably came from Spain and was buried by a Phoenician merchant on the Mediterranean coast in Israel. And can you imagine the lucky guy that excavated that jar? And he goes, "This is heavier than most jars of clay." And so they cut out a section of it and realized all of these were bags of silver nuggets in that jar of clay. Cleaned it up. That's what the silver looked like once they took it out and cleaned it. And then there was a hoard found in Greece in the 20th century of 72 silver and 2 bronze coins in a clay. They found in this clay pot, kind of like the one I showed a while ago. And this is from 150 BC. Beautiful coins. Just that jar was just filled with that. Well, what's our treasure? It's the gospel of the honor of Christ, chapter 4. It's the life of Christ in us, verse 10. And it is the joy that he mentions throughout this whole letter. I'm going to stop at this point since our time is up. I could obviously go a lot longer. But any takeaways from this, at least as you read this chapter, you can see the treasure that we have is this gospel that honors Christ and his life. It is actually the life of Jesus we live out. In fact, if you'll look at what verse, just saw one that seemed to fit so well. Oh, I know what it is. I'll mention it in a minute in the sermon. It's from 1 John 1 about our life in Christ. And then joy. How could Paul have such joy when he had so many challenges and struggles? Well, it's this treasure. This treasure. And I was in Kenya about 3 weeks ago, did a retreat for missionaries in Western Kenya. And you hear their stories, and it's amazing. One brother who has gone in, he was a retired teacher in kind of Western Kenya among the Kikuyu. And the churches in an area have sent him as a missionary over to Tanzania to work among the Dakoga. And the stories he tells, it's just amazing to me how everybody meets as a friend. Churches are popping up all over there. And he's full of joy, and yet he has suffered so much. I'm thinking, you could come up with a list that could compete with Paul. All the things that he suffered. And yet, he's a person of joy. He's a person of peace because of the real difference that Christ made in his life. Because he lives with purpose, and he does. And it was It was a blessing for me to visit with him some in Kenya a few weeks ago. Yes?
Just a comment. Treasure in a worldly sense is often hoarded, and the more it's hoarded, the more valuable it becomes.
Yeah.
Whereas godly treasure is more abundant when it's shared.
Yes.
It actually increases
Right.
by sharing.
And you remember the parable Jesus told about somebody who hid treasure in the field? You know, and gave it back to the owner, and that didn't go over too well, did it? No. Wanted it shared. Multiply what you have. Pass it on. Yes. Pay it forward, we often say. Thank you. Good. Any other reflection?
I guess 2 Corinthians 4:15 in here illustrates the point Stuart's making. Everything happens for your good, so that God's gracious love will touch many more lives. They'll be thankful, and this will overflow for the glory of God.
Yes. So we're not even limited to our clay pots. It can keep being refilled. When you're walking with the Lord, it never runs out if He has this unlimited strength or power. Look at 2 Corinthians. Let me conclude with this verse, because this is one of those places where I bring up joy, the last point. Because in his collection for the poor in Jerusalem, Paul drops in this golden nugget of a principle. Chapter 9, verse 8. For God is able, remember that, God is able. I may not be able, but God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. You think he overstated himself a little bit? But that's how Paul did what he did. He was convinced that God had the power, even though he didn't. He was the clay pot. But God had the power. God was able to do what he could not do himself, but in order to make this grace abound to everyone, especially those in Corinth. Let's pray.